Forced to recognize that you are Lord, and beside you there is none other. We notice and note, Lord, that blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Unless you keep the city, Lord, the watchmen labor and vacant within vain. So bless our undertakings today in this place for this country, in Jesus' name. Our Father, who art in heaven, thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. As we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation. Deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Marvin Day, Frank Campbell, Dionisio Diagula, Michael Pintar, Darren Hanfield, Ramal Ferreira, Renisha Rose, Brenda Rose, Ellsworth Johnson, Timothy, Vaughn Miller, Patricia Parker Edson, Aaron Lewis, Carlton Bodak, James Harvey, Travis Robinson, Adrian Gibson, Donald Saunders, Frederick Michael Pine, Hank Johnson, Mark Hume, Michael Folk, Miriam Beckley Emmanuel, Reese Gibson, Nathan Ranning, Ricky Mackey, Shannon North, Cartwright, Shonell Ferguson, Glennis Anna Martin, Kaiser Sean, Chester Cooper.
Morning again, honorable members. At this time, the chair will take the opportunity to extend the courtesy to the Deputy Speaker, the member for Tall Pines, who will bring a brief report on his trip to Canada. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Tall Pines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for your indulgence. I promise to be very, very quick with respect to this report. Speaker, I just wish to report on a conference that I would have attended on behalf of this Parliament, the Parliamentary Conference and the 6th Open Parliament Partnership Summit 2019, which was held on 28th to the 31st of June 2019 in Ottawa, Canada. Speaker, I was privileged to attend that conference with Senator the Honorable Reynard Henfield, who actually appeared in his capacity, his official capacity as Vice President of the Parliamentary Open Parliament Network for the Caribbean. I'm also proud to say, Mr. Speaker, who was in our gallery this morning, Matthew Aubrey, who is the Executive Director of Organization for Responsible Governance. He was also present at that conference representing the Bahamas and the civil societies here in the Bahamas. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, that the conference was indeed an enjoyable one. Parliamentary is an organization made up of about 35 national legislatures throughout the Americas, which works to support innovative programs to assist parliaments in transparency, working with them with respect to their partnerships with civil society, especially, Mr. Speaker, ethics, gender issues in Parliament. This particular conference, I must say, Mr. Speaker, at least from my perspective, we did a lot of networking with regards to our participation with civil society and how we could work as a parliament and as constituencies throughout the Bahamas with civil society, getting them involved with the activities of Parliament at even the committee stages or at the stages when we could dialogue with them and get their input. That's always been a very important commitment of this government. And so this government felt it necessary for us to represent ourselves at this particular conference. The Speaker, as I said, we would have broken into various subcommittees to discuss issues relating to gender in politics, transparency and accountability, civil society involvement in politics, and their importance in the democratic process. Speaker, I don't wish to go through all of those committees and activities that we would have went through, but I would table a brief report in regards to this conference, and to also add that our own Senator Henfield, he also participated in one of the sessions, given the Bahamas' perspective and the Bahamas' involvement with civil society and what we've been doing over the years to promote this very important aspect of democracy in the Bahamas. So, Mr. Speaker, I would attach to my brief report a copy of the activity report from that session that has information on all the sessions, and to also invite my colleagues here in this Parliament and in the Senate to review this report, to visit Parliamentary website and the Open Government Network website, where you'll be able to get additional information. Mr. Speaker, I table this report in line with this government's commitment to report on activities and travel done throughout the world on behalf of the Bahamian people to this Parliament. And so, Mr. Speaker, the report is attached, and just for the record of members, Parliamentary, they are inviting us to continue to participate in the activities. The next activity, Mr. Speaker, is the 4th gathering of the Parliamentary Network on Climate Change. I know we were trying to encourage you, Mr. Speaker, to attend that conference as a meteorologist, advancing climate action through legislation and parliamentary oversight. And that conference, Mr. Speaker, is to be held on the 8th to the 9th of August, 2019 in Suriname. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table this report on the Parliamentary Conference and the 6th Open Parliament Partnership Summit 2019 in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, 2019. Speaker.
Thank you. Order that the document be brought up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order that document to lie on the table. Introduction and swearing in of new members. Laying of documents by ministers. The chair recognizes Honorable Kalani.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to lay on the table of House a copy of the following. The Bahamas Bureau of Standards and Quality Annual Report and Audited Financial Statements for the year ended 31st December 2017.
Order that the document be brought up. Order that the document do lie on the table. Further laying of documents by ministers. Chair recognizes the honourable member for Mount Moriah.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to lay on the table of the House a copy of the following: the Registration of Sexual Offenders Regulations 2019.
Order that the document be brought up. Order that the document to lie on the table. Further laying of documents by ministers. The chair recognizes the honourable member for Marathon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Crave your indulgence to lay on the table the Gaming Amendment Regulations 2019 and the Gaming House Operator Amendment Number 2 Regulations 2019, Mr. Speaker.
And do them one at a time for me, please.
Yes,
What is
Mr.
the
Speaker.
first one?
Beginning with the Gaming Amendment Regulations 2019, Mr. Speaker.
Order that the document be brought up. Order that the document do lie on the table. Further laying of documents by ministers. Chair recognizes the honorable member for Marizon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your indulgence. The second document I wish to lay on the table of the House of Assembly is the Gaming House Operator Amendment Number 2, Regulations 2019, Mr. Speaker.
Order that the document be brought up. Order that the document to lie on the table. Further laying of documents by ministers. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Carmichael.
Speaker, I stand for lady this morning. The independent auditor report for the store market authority for 2013, 2014, and 2015.
Order that the document be brought up. Order that the document to lie on the table. Further laying of documents by ministers. Thank you, honorable member. Order that documents to lie on the table. Statements and communications by ministers. Communications by the clerk. Messages from the Governor General. Messages from the Senate. Honorable members, I have in my possession message number 35 from the Honorable Senate, message to the Honorable Speaker and members of the House of Assembly from the Honorable President and honorable members of the Senate. The Honorable Senate acquaints the Honorable House of Assembly that they have passed the following bill accompanying message number 20 dated the 5th of December 2018 from the Honorable House of Assembly and have made no amendments. A bill for an act to provide for the regulation of non-profit organizations and for connected purposes. Order that the message to lie on the table. Motions for leave of absence, leave to resign seat, and new writs. Presentation of petitions. Presentations of reports of committees. Adoption of reports of committees. First reading of bills. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Yamakro.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to lay a compendium of bills this morning, which this side and the side opposite have agreed to debate today. First, Mr. Speaker, I would beg leave of this honorable House. Okay.
Continue, honorable member. Just lay the bills individually, one at a time.
I'm going to, yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave first to withdraw the Anti-Terrorism Amendment Bill, number 87 on the agenda, and substitute.
Honorable member, is there a motion? You're moving a motion?
Yes, yes, Mr. Speaker. I move a motion, Mr. Speaker, to withdraw the Anti-Terrorism Amendment Bill 2019, number 87 on the agenda.
Number 87, you said? Yes. Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the following bill be withdrawn. A bill for an act to amend the Anti-Terrorism Act to provide for the definition of designated entity and the offense of proliferation and financing of proliferation in respect to reporting requirements. As many as in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. The bill is withdrawn. Chair recognizes the honorable member for Yamakro.
Mr. Speaker, I rise and beg leave to introduce and have read for the first time a bill for an act to amend the Anti-Terrorism Act to provide for the definition of designated entity and the offenses of proliferation and the financing of proliferation in respect to reporting regime.
Order that the notice be brought up. Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for the first time. A bill for an act to amend the Anti-Terrorism Act to provide for the definition of designated entity and the offense of proliferation and the financing of proliferation in respect to reporting requirements. As many as in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. Order that the bill be read for the first time.
A bill for an act to amend the Anti-Terrorism Act to provide for the definition of designated entity and the offense of proliferation and the financing of proliferation in respect to reporting requirements.
The chair recognizes the honorable member for Yamakro.
I beg leave to introduce and have read for the first time a bill for an act to amend the International Obligations, Economic and Ancillary Measures Act.
Order that the notice be brought up. Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for the first time. A bill for an act to amend the International Obligations, Economic and Ancillary Measures Act. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. Order that the bill be read for the first time.
A bill for an act to amend the International Obligations, Economic and Ancillary Measures Act.
The chair recognizes the honorable member for Yamakro.
Speaker, I beg leave to introduce and have read for the first time a bill for an act to amend the Investment Funds Act 2019.
Order that the notice be brought up. Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for the first time. A bill for an act to amend the Investment Funds Act 2019. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. Order that the bill be read for the first time.
A bill for an act to amend the Investment Fund Act.
The chair recognizes the honorable member for Yamakro.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce and have read for the first time a bill for an act to amend the Non-Profit Organization Act 2019.
Order that the notice be brought up. Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for the first time. A bill for an act to amend the Non-Profit Organizations Act 2019. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. Order that the bill be read for the first time.
A bill for an act to amend the Non-Profit Organization Act 2019.
The chair recognizes the honorable member for Yamakro. Please play the first reading of bills.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce and have read for the first time a bill for an act to amend the Register of Beneficial Ownership Act 2018. 19, Mr. Speaker. I do apologize.
Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for the first time. A bill for an act to amend the Register of Beneficial Ownership Act 2019. As many as in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. Order that the bill be read for the first time.
A bill for an act to amend the Register of Beneficial Ownership Act 2019.
For the first reading of bills, the chair recognizes the honorable member for Yamakro.
No further first reading. I have had.
Second reading and committal of bills. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Bamboo Town.
Mr. Speaker, we do have, from my understanding, the agreement of the other side to both table and debate these bills today. And so we want to make sure that it's on the record.
Thank you. What is the position from the in agreement? Honorable members,
we just want to thank the other side for the opportunity to debate and pass today, even if it's true coercion.
Honorable members, are we proceeding with a compendium of bills? What is the lead bill?
The leading bill would be the anti-terrorism.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Yamakro.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's indeed a profound privilege and honor to stand in this honorable house. Thank you very much. It's indeed a profound privilege, Mr. Speaker, and honor to stand in this honorable house to lead off the debate a compendium of bills, namely the anti-terrorism amendment bill, the international obligation, economic and ancillary measures bill, the register of beneficial ownership amendment bill. the Investment Funds Act Amendment Bill and the Non-Profit Amendment. Is it on?
Are we having a technical difficulty with his microphone? Can you turn the volume up a bit, please?
Okay, thank you very much. It's indeed a privilege to be here to commence this debate, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I begin, I would just like to express profound gratitude to Almighty God and also the good residents of the Yamacraw constituency. At the end of my presentation, Mr. Speaker, I would just like to make a small note of some of the activities in our community. Mr. Speaker, there's an article that is to be published very shortly entitled "The Financial Services in the Bahamas, Adapting to Changing Landscape, a Policy Update." And I think the first 3 chapters in the proposed article fully represent the work over the past few years of different administrations in trying to protect, build, and being innovative and proactive, preserve the financial services industry. And I quote, Mr. Speaker, "For over 80 years, the Bahamas has maintained a successful track record of competing for foreign direct investment and offering wealth management services. One of the key reasons for this success is the Bahamas' position as an internationally recognized center for the provision of financial services. The growth of our economy necessarily requires change, and change is never comfortable. Is never a comfortable endeavor. Some of the changes will inevitably call for reform and structural transformation, sometimes involving cultural shifts, technological upgrades, training, and retooling as we strive to modernize our economy and position ourselves to take advantage of the abundance of opportunities fueled by the global changes happening around us. The strategy, therefore, has a clear vision for the Bahamas as a recognized location of choice for specialist international financial services, product, and services innovation, established infrastructure, excellent client service, friendly investment policies and incentives, and flexible adaptability to change management in a well-regulated environment. And that has been the activities, Mr. Speaker, for over 80 years in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, especially over the past 20 years, as we've had certain changes in the financial services sector. Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to stand present in this honorable House of Assembly, presenting my contribution on behalf of the good people of the Yamacraw constituency, and as the newly appointed Minister of Financial Services, Immigration, and Trade and Industry. Mr. Speaker, as the former Minister of State in the Office of the Attorney General, I'm very much aware of the challenges faced by this country to attain and maintain compliance with international standards in the fight against terrorism and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And Mr. Speaker, although I do not see him, I intend to make reference to him in my presentation today. I would just like to recognize the Honorable Attorney General in the person of Mr. Carl Bethel. I could hear his voice emanating into this honorable chamber. There he goes. I would just like to make recognition of him and the hard work that he has done. And Mr. Speaker, before the end of my presentation, I will also thank and congratulate the industry partners who played a very important part in assisting this government and governments past in preserving the financial services industry. Minister Bethel and the Ministry of Legal Affairs have been caught up in a fierce fight over the last 2 years to ward off measures being levied on this country for the for the gaps and weaknesses levied on this country, for the gaps and weaknesses identified in the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force mutual evaluation of the Bahamas. The Caribbean Financial Action Task Force Mutual Evaluation Report was published in July 2017. Detailed actions required by the Bahamas to be undertaken to address the identified gaps and weaknesses. While stationed in the Ministry of Legal Affairs, I have had the privilege of working alongside Minister Bethel, and not just Minister Bethel, the former Minister of Financial Services, and most certainly the Deputy Prime Minister, as both of three ministers worked extremely hard along with the government to rescue or preserve and build upon the strong foundation laid in the past. And so, Mr. Speaker, in correcting that, I say I've had the privilege of working alongside with Minister Bethel and his capable and able personnel and the identified risk framework committee members as they plunge headfirst into addressing the issues at hand. They have worked tirelessly over these last 24 months, and the labor has paid off. Mr. Speaker, in November 2018, the country was re-rated for technical compliance with the Financial Action Task Force, 40 recommendations, and 13 revised favorable upgrades, bringing the Bahamas on par with the European Union, United States of America, and other major members of the Financial Action Task Force, standing compliant or largely compliant with 30 out of 40 recommendations. Mr. Speaker, we stand to debate these amendment bills that assist the Bahamas in complying with several of the remaining matters required to be addressed in the country's Financial Action Task Force action plan. The Anti-Terrorism Bill, Amendment Bill 2019, and I go to that bill, Mr. Speaker. Clause 2 of the bill seeks to provide for the definition of designated persons or entity and proliferation. Clause 3 through to 5 of the bill seeks to amend Section 6, 7, and 8 of the Act to clarify that those sections related to proliferation or biological weapons and toxins, chemical weapons, and nuclear weapons, as well as the case may be. Clause 6 of the bill seeks to provide that designated entities has the same meaning as designated persons or entity. Clause 6 also seeks to provide that the National Identified Risk Framework Coordinator is responsible for circulating the list referred to in Section 43 through Section 43 of the Act relating to the Steering Committee. Further, Clause 6 also seeks to amend Section 43 of the Act to provide that the members of the Identified Risk Framework Steering Committee are required to publish the list and request from the Attorney General, public and financial institutions, financial information about persons named on the list. Clause 7 of the bill seeks to repeal and replace Section 43 of the Act to provide for the procedure to be taken by any person as well as financial institutions after the list referred to in Section 43 has been published. Clause 8 of the bill seeks to amend Section 45 of the Act to correct a cross-reference consequent to the amendment in Clause 7. Clause 9 of the bill seeks to amend Section 49 of the Act to provide that a financial institution should make a report to the Financial Intelligence Unit where there is reasonable ground to suspect that funds maintained by it are those belonging to a person who commits acts of proliferation or participate in or facilitate the commission of proliferation acts or the financing of proliferation. Simply put, Mr. Speaker, the Bahamas, as we're being regulated, as other territories are being regulated around the world, is required to ensure that we are a safe jurisdiction where no acts or funding or quarter will be given to anybody who is participating in providing the creation or of weapons of mass destruction. And so that is what we're attempting to do there, to increase the regulation so that the Bahamas can be seen as a safe place for investment and for people to come to. The International Obligations, Economic and Ancillary Measures Amendment Bill 2019. This bill seeks to amend the Principal Act to insert a new Section 3A to provide for the immediate effect in law of any United Nations Security Council resolution which imposes a sanction. This bill also seeks to provide for the compliance by all persons with the imposition of sections in accordance with the resolution. Section 3 of the proposed new Section 3A further seeks to provide that the Governor General must make an order implementing that resolution within 3 months of the date of the adoption of the resolution by the United Nations Security Council. Simply put, Mr. Speaker, once the United Nations Security Council issues an edict, in order to carry them out, we've signed on to the treaty in order to bring those things or bring the requirements of the sanctions into play. We've agreed as a country that they would go immediately into effect. So that so sometimes, not sometimes, almost they save lives, save resources, and they also put the Bahamas in a good light in terms of how the world is moving, Mr. Speaker. The non-profit organization bill. Mr. Speaker, I would like to commend persons in civil society, and I heard my colleague from Tall Pines make mention of the fact that representatives from civil society is here in the House, in this honorable House. I would like to thank the church and all members of civil society who work assiduously with the government to ensure that we collaborate to bring the best possible bill to this House for the purpose of representing the Bahamas and the people of the Bahamas. And Mr. Speaker, I've said before, one of the perpetrators of 9/11, and I'm speaking now as Minister of Education, of Immigration, to get the name of that individual who was on that island, who stopped, he's not a gentleman, that man, from entering our country when they attempted to come to the Bahamas some years back. I don't think we've ever identified or fully recognized that individual because that person was on duty. All accounts show that they were courteous and efficient, and at that stage they prevented someone from entering this country who participated in one of the most heinous acts in recent times. And so, Mr. Speaker, one of the vehicles for perpetrating that act was non-profit organizations. And so as we strive through regulation to bring a greater clarity and transparency to non-profit organizations in the Bahamas, I want to commend the church, the civil society for assisting the Bahamas in this vein. The Non-Profit Organization Bill 2019 revokes and replaces the Companies Non-Profit Organization Regulation 2014. The bill seeks to provide for the regulation of non-profit organizations to ensure that such organizations are operating in a transparent manner and are not engaged in activities which constitute identified risks. And at the end of my presentation, Mr. Speaker, I will give the definition of identified risk, which includes money laundering or whatever have you. Clause 2 of the bill defines identified risk as having the meaning ascribed to it under the Proceedings of Crime Act, Chapter 93. An identified risk in relation to a non-profit organization is any act that involves corruption, cybercrime, human trafficking, money laundering, proliferation of financing of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, or financing of terrorism, or such other act as the minister may prescribe by order under the Proceedings of Crime Act and the I do recall that the AG, the Honorable Attorney General, was describing an experience that persons had when they recently, thank you, excuse me, when they recently visited another place, and they were speaking to their counterparts about the regulations that were intended or are in place in the Bahamas, and they were saying that the position of the Bahamas was mild in comparison to what they were experiencing. Part 2 of the bill deals with the administration. Clause 3 of the bill seeks to provide for the appointment of the registrar of non-profit organizations who will be responsible for the administration of the act. Clause 4 seeks to provide for functions of the registrar, which include, among other things, A, receiving representations from the public about persons who have engaged in or are engaging in conduct that constitute or may constitute a breach of this act or an identified risk. Referring cases of non-compliance with this act, including acts of misconduct or mismanagement to the Commissioner of Police. Enhancing the accountability of nonprofit organizations to donor, beneficiaries, and the general public. And J, promoting public trust and confidence in nonprofit organizations. And I quite recall when we were having this discussion about the regulation of nonprofits, sometimes all we had is a name. And I remember the AG saying, when you went to one of the sessions, the Financial Transaction Task Force, and they'd asked how many nonprofits we had, that persons, not that anybody was trying to pull anything on anybody, but they knew. Sometimes you only have a name, and you have a name that may not accord, like, you know, we have a church and it's properly regulated, the Naked Truth Baptist Church. Where is this church located? Who is in this church? How are they getting their funds? And so these are the things, Mr. Speaker, that we are obligated to do to properly regulate these organizations. And I cannot stop thanking, because when we first started these consultations, it was very rigorous, but with the collaboration of the government, civil society, and most certainly the church, we were able to cross over some hurdles. Clause 5 of the bill seeks to provide that the minister has the power to give general policy directions to the registrar relating to exercise of the registrar's functions, and the registrar shall comply with such general directions. Clause 6 of the bill provides for the establishment of a non-profit register, which shall be open to the public inspection during regular hours. Part 3, or clauses 7 through 10 of the bill deals with the registration of non-profit organizations. Clause 7 of the bill provides the matters which the registrar takes into consideration when processing an application for registration. Some of those considerations include, among other things, the organization's anticipated source of contribution. B, the organization's records of contributions and contributors. C, evidence of how the contributions were or are to be applied. D, evidence of know your client compliance. And E, evidence of board structure and functions. Clause 8 of the bill seeks to establish that a certificate of registration will be valid for 2 years only. The grounds for refusal of an application to the registrar are also provided for under this part. Part 4, or clauses 11 to 17 of the bill covers the powers of the registrar. Clause 12 of the bill seeks to provide the grounds upon which the registrar can strike a nonprofit organization off the register. Clause 13 deals with the registrar's power to require certain information from a nonprofit organization. Part 5, or clauses 18 to 25, deals with the record keeping and reporting obligation of a nonprofit organization, which include records as to the purpose and maintaining financial records, as well as making a declaration of the availability of such financial records. Clause 22 of the bill seeks to provide that the registrar may give written notice to require the production of financial records only where he or she reasonably requires the records specified in the notice to assess the extent to which a nonprofit organization is engaged in activities that are identified risk. And this is very important, Mr. Speaker. It's not an attempt to go on a witch hunt. The registrar must be motivated by reasonable suspicion in order to ask somebody to bring their records forward. Clause 23 of the bill seeks to provide that the registrar shall hold financial records in confidence. Furthermore, the clause seeks to provide that if the registrar has reasonable cause to suspect that a nonprofit organization is engaged in any activity which qualifies as an identified risk, the registrar shall, after consultation with the minister, provide the financial records and all other relevant information to the Commissioner of Police or the Financial Intelligence Unit for investigation. Clause 24 of the bill seeks to provide that nonprofit organizations must report to the registrar any donations or disbursements of $50,000 or more made by one person in a year, whether the sum is paid in lump sum or as an aggregated sum. Clause 25 of the bill provides for financial institutions and designated non-financial business and professions to ensure that nonprofit organizations are registered in order to open and maintain bank accounts or account ledgers. Clause 26 provides that where a nonprofit organization fails to renew its registration within 6 months of its expiration, the institution shall freeze all of the nonprofit organization's accounts. And Mr. Speaker, we have had extensive consultation with the industry and civil society, and I know that there's going to be ongoing training in this regard to highlight the significance and why the regulations are extremely important and necessary. Part 6, or clauses 27 to 35, provides for the miscellaneous provision. Clause 27 of the bill seeks to provide the offenses of supplying false information to the registrar, providing misleading information, and withholding information. Clause 28 of the bill seeks to provide the right of appeal to a court against a decision of the registrar to refuse an application for registration or cancel or suspend the registration of a nonprofit organization. Clause 34 of the bill seeks to provide for savings and traditional provisions to ensure that relevant acts done under the revoked company's nonprofit organization regulations 2014 are preserved. Additionally, the registrants or registration done under the revoked regulations must register within 90 days of its coming into force of the act. Clause 35 of the bill provides for the non-application of Part 5 to specific nonprofit organizations. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, and I know you see me, I'm using my technical apparatus here. And the reason why I do it is because the Prime Minister has indicated that we're going paperless. And so, in that vein, I've taken the opportunity not only to say it to all that I associate with, but even to my colleagues that very shortly, and I think the Speaker's spoken to it, that then Mr. Prime Minister said we'll get cabinet papers. And you can imagine how much money we'll save if the entire public service is no longer using paper. Right now, we're going through an extensive digitization process, and we're doing that in immigration. Once you bring, and I would like to commend Sinan and the work done there. Once you bring your applications into immigration, they go into a system, and we scan those in, and then we return your paper to you. So, and then what we want the public to know is you only have 2 payments to make. You make the first one when you make the application, and if you are successful, then there's a fee that you pay. There are no other fees. But what is most beneficial about the digitization process is that no finder's fees. What is most important about the digitization process is it makes things easier. It saves the government a whole lot of money, but it brings the services to the people. And so I gave that as an explanation, Mr. Speaker, as you see me going through my cell phone. I look forward to the day when, as you indicate, when we'll have the rules. We can put what we are referring to up on the chart. But I was looking for the Bahamas Financial Services Board and the members who make up that board. And this morning I was having discussions with Ms. Tanya McCartney about the proposed amendments. And she was communicating that she had gone through some of them and that the majority of them. And in the main, they found no fault with them. As a matter of fact, they thought that they enhanced the regulatory regime in which the Bahamas is a part of, both nationally and internationally. And she said that these were issues that were discussed at the Financial Action Task Force meeting that's normally held at the Attorney General's office. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Attorney General and I, and the Minister of Finance, up to the time of my substantive appointment as Minister of Financial Services, Immigration, Trade and Industry, as well as legal advisors to the government, have collaborated with members of civil society and the wider general public to address, through legislation, the concerns of a diverse variety of representative groups in our society. We have been an inclusive government seeking to address the concerns of all citizens in the Commonwealth. This government has diligently been hard at work, ensuring that we bring the kind of bills which represents the real positive change in our society, and to enable this country to comply with international best standards and practices in the fight against terrorism, money laundering. We anticipate that we will continue to bring progressive and innovative legislation to be debated in this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, that is my presentation, but I crave your indulgence just to make one point about an activity that occurred in our community, in the community of Yamacraw. Mr. Speaker, on last evening, I would like to recognize and commend an innovative, self-motivated, patriotic, and loyal Bahamian citizen in the person of Long Island, Mr. Adrian Gibson, MP for Long Island, and also the executive chairman for the Water and Sewage Corporation. Mr. Speaker, he graced us with his presence on last night at our Constituency Association meeting, and he provided an in-depth review of the government's not just plan, but implementation of potable water in the Family Islands and New Providence. And Mr. Speaker, I just want to thank him for what he did. I'm exceedingly excited for the first time. I know I used to go to the well in Cat Island. I don't see Cat Island Rumkins in Salvador. Yes. I used to go to the well in Cat Island. You had to walk a great distance to get it. And finally, you have a cost-effective way being implemented in the Family Islands for persons, to have something that's simple. It's very simple, potable water. So I want to thank you for coming. But what happened last night, Mr. Speaker, is I told the persons is the Prime Minister, the Most Honorable Dr. Hubert Minnis, mandated of his ministers and MPs that there is to be direct interaction with members of the community, civil society, and the media. So we aren't to avoid questions. Obviously, there are certain things that you may not be able to reveal. But to go to the community yourselves, have direct conversations with them. And so Mr. Gibson came. There were no screens. Persons were able to ask him questions. He was able to respond. I was there. I told of the government's plan. I gave them a synopsis of an excellent presentation given by the Honorable Prime Minister at the conference being held now by Regional Public Service Union. I reiterate the plan for land reform, and some of these legislation I think are some of the most progressive since we established our Constitution. Land is being used for all sorts of things, Mr. Speaker. And so we've laid the white paper. There's been a delivery unit established by the Prime Minister that's looking to grant to all Bahamians crown land in which they find themselves thereon, with one caveat that you cannot sell the property to other persons. I don't know if we are aware, but to non-Bahamians. But there's a land, almost like a land grab going on in the Bahamas. And the time has come and has long since passed for registered conveyance. If we had a proper system of registered conveyance, Mr. Speaker, we wouldn't have, the Linden Finland estate would have never existed because you couldn't sell property 3 and 4 times. Posey in town, never, because you couldn't have sold properties 3 and 4 times. I told them about the over-the-hill development. We're now almost in the middle, almost come to the end of the 4th industrial revolution. And so digitization is a must. We must digitize every aspect of the public service to bring a greater degree of transparency to the system. Free education for persons who qualify in UE or the technical training school, early learning for children in the preschools. And so those are the things that we're focusing on, and small business development. Mr. Speaker, again, I thank Mr. Gibson. I thank the members of Yamacraw, the constituency of Yamacraw. I would just like to recognize my family from Charles Island. I thank my aunt, my mother, and all of those who God has placed in my life to provide some wind under my wings. And not only that, for reminding me of the virtue of humility as I serve, and the frailty of life, that if you live for 80 years, it's still a very short time. So while you're here, try your best to give your best. And remember that the goal is to serve, mentor while service, and also succession, preparing young persons to take the mantle and go on. Mr. Speaker, those are my submissions, and I support those bills.
Thank you, Honorable Member. Is there a seconder? The Chair recognizes the Honorable Member for East Grand Bahama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, gives me I don't know, Mr. Clark. Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to stand and to second these amendments in this compendium of legislation before us today. I recognize that the period between presentation and debate is relatively short, and I do want to thank the opposition for cooperating with us in that regard, as these are relatively urgent amendments that are necessary to ensure that we keep pace with the changes and the requirements for us to address the challenges of the FATF and the OECD and all the other alphabet soup people that we all have our issues with and may or may not agree with, but yet are very necessary and important to our way of life and to our economy. Mr. Speaker, before I start, I just want to congratulate those officers, police officers, who this morning and tomorrow morning will be receiving their commendation and medals over at Government House. I'm very proud of all of them particularly those that I am very familiar with. And I will not call them because then I have to call some other people. But I am very proud of all of them, and I'm satisfied that they're all deserving. The police officers in this country, Mr. Speaker, work very hard and take a lot of risk for the safety of all of us. And for that, they rarely are thanked, rarely are they appreciated for the tremendous sacrifices that they make. And so today they receive some recognition, and we certainly want to commend them and to congratulate them for this achievement and recognition that they receive today. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate Toriano Johnson, the boxer, middleweight boxer, who just recently won the North American Boxing Federation middleweight title. Again, Mr. Speaker, proving that Bahamians can compete anywhere, in any discipline, at any time. And you know, we often laud our track and field athletes, and we give them tremendous recognition. But there are other sporting disciplines that Bahamians are competing at on a world stage, on a world-class level, and this is just one of them. This week also in I forgot where they are now. There's a swimming competition going on where Grand Bahamian Joanna Evans is competing, and she's doing well, representing the Bahamas on the world stage in swimming. And I know that there's another swimming team that is going to a competition very shortly. We certainly want to wish them well. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, I do want to remind the public, particularly, and I hope I'm not speaking on the toes of the Minister of Sports, but the track and field championships will be held in Grand Bahama this weekend, the 26th to the 27th, beginning on the 26th at 6 p.m. at the Grand Bahama Sports Complex. And we certainly want to encourage all sports enthusiasts and those who are proud Bahamians to come out and support that event. We will have the world-class athletes, our own world-class athletes, there participating in that track and field championship. And so it's an opportunity to see first-class, homegrown talent on display. That's Shawnee Miller and Stephen Gardner. Both, pardon me? And the rest of the crew will be in Grand Bahama. So I want to encourage certainly all Grand Bahamians to come out, maybe touch field and get an autograph, and for those from Nassau and around the Bahamas to come out and support that track and field championship and to support our athletes. I am thinking about the celebrity race. It was interesting. I ran a fun run walk on last weekend, and it seems like I need to do a little more training. But Mr. Speaker, with respect to the amendments today, I just want to give a bit of good news in respect to the efforts that we've made over the last 2 years with respect to meeting the standards and the challenges that have been put before us in terms of meeting the global standards. And I'll just read this press release. It's a press release, and I'll just read it. The Bahamas passed the latest assessment of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, confirming that the jurisdiction is a safe place for financial services and corporate investment activities. The OECD concluded that the domestic legal framework is in line with international standards and therefore not harmful, which is a nod to the slate of legislative and regulatory reforms undertaken by the government since the new year. On July 19, 2019, the Global Forum on Harmful Tax Practices and Exchange of Information through the Inclusive Framework on BEPS, or Base Erosion of Profit Shifting, approved the latest results of the peer review of the Bahamas' domestic law on economic substance, which was conducted by the OECD's Forum on Harmful Tax Practices, or FHTP, at its meeting in June 2019 in Paris.
This confirmation by the OECD that the Bahamas' domestic laws are not harmful affirms the Bahamas as a premier partner in the global fight against harmful tax practices and reinforces the international community, reinforces to the international community that the Bahamas is a safe place for financial services and other investment activities. Our commitment to the enhancement of transparency mechanisms demonstrates yet again that the Bahamas will not be a jurisdiction that encourages or facilitates financial crimes, including tax evasion and money laundering. The Ministry of Finance will now ensure all participants in the financial services sector, including regulators, industry, and stakeholders, are doing their part to monitor full compliance with all the provisions of the new laws. The Working Group on Financial Sector Reform will continue to review our legislative framework and engage with the international organizations to ensure the interests of our financial services sector are represented and protected. The FHTP assessment concluded that the domestic legal framework of the Bahamas was not harmful to the International Substantial Activities Requirement Standard. That standard requires that jurisdictions that have legislation in line with the BEPS Action 5 minimum standard, which identifies globally mobile activities such as financial services, and that the core income generating activities must be conducted with an adequate amount of qualified employees and operating expenses within the jurisdiction. Attending the June FHTP meeting on behalf of the Bahamas was Stephen Coakley-Wells, Director of Regulatory and International Affairs at the Ministry of Finance, and Adriana Knowles-Ramming, Legal Officer at the Ministry of Finance. And I want to thank them for their continued efforts to ensure that we remain updated and that we address the issues as they come up at these forums. In December 2018, the Bahamas enacted the Commercial Enterprise Substance Requirements Act 2018. And this legislation addressed the concerns of the European Union that the Bahamas provide a commercial environment with no or low effective tax rates or income, which attracted investments through corporate vehicles, which have no substantial economic presence and which do not engage in real economic activity within the jurisdiction. The EU's assessment of the Bahamas' substance legislation was conducted in March of 2019 and was the basis for the EU to determine that the Bahamas should not be included on the list of non-cooperative jurisdictions for tax purposes, which was published that same month. In 2020, the OECD will review the implementation of these new laws and the effectiveness of the laws in practice. And so again, I just want to thank the team as they continue to do substantial work in ensuring that we continue to fulfill our commitments. And I do want to share and join with the Minister of Financial Services and Immigration in thanking the Attorney General's Office, as well as the former Minister of Financial Services and Immigration, and all of our respective support staff for the tremendous commitment and work that we've done over the last 2 years. It's been thankless work, and we have been second-guessed and lambasted and maligned and called all manner of names and accused of all manner of things. But Mr. Speaker, nonetheless, we've persevered, and I believe that as we see today, that we will continue to see as we go forward, that work will provide value and stability for this industry, as well as for the economy of the Bahamas, and so we press on. No, Chester didn't do that to me. Chester, the member for Exuma understands fully well this industry, despite sometimes he has to do what he has to do. But he understands fully well this industry, as I am convinced that most of us do. Although we say things for political reasons, we understand fully what we have to do to support this industry. and so that's why, and I encourage the public, because you hear from time to time people who may not necessarily understand the industry, but hear the rhetoric when they talk about this alphabet group of entities and how this side is pandering to foreign interests versus domestic interests. And you hear that rhetoric. I want to encourage the public to bear in mind that it is exactly that. It is rhetoric. Because I know, I know you don't want me to particularly say that because it doesn't fit the bill. Particularly this week, I know that tomorrow and the next day and the next day you have some rhetoric that you want to put forth. But I'll preempt you and just say to the public, listen carefully, okay? Because there's political spin and there's the reality. And we have an obligation to ensure that we protect this industry and we do what is necessary, as whether we like it or not. We are participants in a global economy that has the ability to do some serious damage to our domestic economy if we are not careful and we are not attentive and that we do not do the things that we need to do to ensure that we are seen to be and are in fact operating on a global level at a global, with global standards. And so again, I want to thank the industry participants for their support and consultation in all that we do. We ensure that we have the feedback of the industry. We don't always agree. I always say that regulators and participants, stakeholders sometimes fall on different sides of the line. It's a necessary and inherent risk or situation because some people want to do and some people don't want to do. But the law must be the law. And so we do appreciate and thank them for their support, generally speaking. But Mr. Speaker, this morning I have the privilege to contribute to this compendium of bills which are designed to strengthen our financial services sector and to sort of close the circle of compliance with the requirements of the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, as well as the OECD and the EU BEPS substance requirements. Over the past year and a half, this legislature has seen and been called upon to totally reform the entire legal architecture governing the banking system and the financial sector. We have all had to participate in this noble endeavor, as I said, with all of its challenges, which has done much to remove the blemishes, gaps, and deficiencies which were identified by what some may call a judgmental world, and which findings since the mutual evaluation conducted in 2015 and published in June 2017, which was just in a few weeks of our election to office, has had such a damaging impact upon our reputation in the perception of some actors in the global financial services sector. Mr. Speaker, these bills will address at least two further recommendations in the FATF's 40 recommendations, and that is recommendation 6 and 7, and upon a reevaluation, would show even higher levels of technical compliance by the Bahamas, up from our current level of being compliant or largely compliant in 30 out of the 40 recommendations. Further, they address the final pieces necessary to fully address several of the immediate outcomes related to the effectiveness of our system of regulation and oversight of the financial sector, namely IOs 10 and 11. Mr. Speaker, the bills before us today, which we have, again, thanks to the opposition, agreed to debate, is the Anti-Terrorism Act, the International Obligation Economic and Ancillary Measures Amendment Act, the Register of Beneficial Ownership Amendment Act, and the Investment Fund Act, and the Non-Profit Act, Amendment Act. Let me first point out that the shaping of these amendments reflect an ongoing dialogue and consultation with the international experts who are helping the Bahamas to fully meet the requirements to exit the gray list of the FATF. So yes, Mr. Speaker, not only do we consult locally, but we also consult internationally because there are developments that are happening so fast that we have to ensure that not only are we scanning the environment for what we can see and anticipate, but also that we engage international consultants and international players, including international offices of some of our local, what were previously offshore entities, to ensure that we get a wide range of views and perspectives, to ensure that our actions line up with developing trends in international standards, and that we address the issues as they arise. As the review group refined their comments on their requirements, this leads to the need, in some cases, to make sometimes small and sometimes large changes. And we aim for the highest standard of regulatory oversight. And so, well enough is simply not good enough. And we've seen this recently in our region, Mr. Speaker, where one country, and I will not name them, tried to be a little cute with some of the legislation that they enacted, and they've recently had to come back after being put on a list that they were not on, being put on a list to address the gaps. And so, again, good is not good enough. We have to make sure that we are proactive and that we are best in class. As the FATF, in some cases, add to their requirements, we will respond, taking no chances and doing all that is in our power to clear the good name of our country and to reestablish the Bahamas as a strong and enduring financial services center. We thus hope to save thousands of high-paying, high-skilled, middle-class jobs for Bahamians. Again, this is not about the elite. This is not about any foreign entity. This is about Bahamians and their survival and prospering of this middle class that is built on tourism and on financial services. Mr. Speaker, these amendments reflect ongoing discussions with the FATF Review Group for the Americas as part of the exit strategy from the FATF's gray list. It was suggested that we should specify which international organizations have the power to list or designate such suspected terrorist persons or entities. Hence, Section 2 of the anti-terrorism amendment of the bill before this House specifically sets out the powers of the UN Security Council Resolution number 1267 Committee and the Resolution number 1988 Committee, both of which have the authority to designate terrorists by name or terrorist entities. That bill further clarifies which sections in the existing Act specifically are intended to refer to proliferation crimes. It should be recalled that our Anti-Terrorism Act applies not only to terrorists, but also to crimes of nuclear, biological, and chemical proliferation and arms trafficking. Section 7 sets out the procedures to be followed when a list of designated persons or entities is received from the United Nations. And Section 9 adds proliferation offenses as being a basis to refer information to the Financial Intelligence Unit for investigation. Mr. Speaker, the International Obligation Amendment, this amendment bill will allow for the automatic domestication of the UN Security Council sanctions into Bahamian law without delay, as the mover would have mentioned. And this automatic domestication can later be referred or later be followed by a formal order issued by the Governor General under the existing provisions of Section 3 of the current law. And we are not unique in this, Mr. Speaker, as the Australian law, which is also a Commonwealth country, currently has this provision. Additional power is being granted to the Governor General to implement any unilateral sanctions issued by a friendly state under the provisions of Section 3 of the existing law. Recently, the United States has issued unilateral sanctions against certain entities involved in nuclear production in Iran. These can now be domesticated into the Bahamian law by an order issued by the Governor General under Section 3. In the event the Governor General does not domesticate any unilateral sanctions, the Attorney General will have the power to circulate the list and to require financial institutions to search their records and reports so that they can be assured that no entity in the Bahamas is breaking any sanctions imposed by another friendly state. Any information obtained can be shared with the Financial Intelligence Unit, the police, or by way of international cooperation in reply to any mutual legal assistance request or a request for judicial cooperation and assistance, or under the Criminal Justice International Cooperation Act. Mr. Speaker, with respect to the Register of Beneficial Ownership Act, the amendment before simply adds all forms of partnerships to the new regime for maintenance of records of beneficial owners. The international standard is for beneficial ownership registers to be maintained in respect of all companies and company-like entities such as partnerships. This is the standard which is the case under the law of our regional and international competitors. And so we're not doing anything over and above what our competitors are doing in this regard. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, one of our competitors did not have this provision, and they were put on a list, and they recently had to amend their own laws to reflect this particular provision. Nonprofit Organizations Act. Mr. Speaker, again, the minister speaking before me spoke to this, and I don't think I need to say much more about it. I will say that it has been widely consulted with all of the relevant organizations, both civic organizations as well as religious organizations and other charitable organizations that had expressed some concern about the level of reporting that was required. Some had felt that it was intrusive. Some had felt that it may identify individuals who may want to give anonymous gifts, not for any nefarious reasons, but for their own personal reasons. And so the amendments that have been made to this, that are being made to this act, provides for what we would call a sort of light touch regulatory framework, where rather than keeping a detail or reporting a detailed list of everybody that has made a donation or made a contribution, that the only thing that is required is that financial records, including that information, is actually maintained and is available in the event that a request is made for that information based upon some other investigation or question in regards to that organization. And so we think that we have struck a reasonably fair balance in respect to the need for regulation and the need for a certain level of privacy with respect to these organizations. I know that, again, it is not perfect in the eyes of some of our NGOs. But again, as I said earlier, there's always a yin and a yang with respect to regulators and industry participants, and sometimes those interests don't necessarily line up. But it's the obligation of the government to ensure that we provide an environment that is unquestioned and that gives us the opportunity, the ability to ensure that our jurisdiction is not used for any nefarious reasons, and we are able to account in the event that we are called upon to provide the information. And so again, I want to thank the various organizations for their input. And again, I hope that they would all agree that this is in fact a reasonable compromise piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, I'll now move on to the Investment Fund Amendment Bill 2019, which was also passed this morning, and I spent a little bit of time on this. But this legislation proposes to amend the Investment Funds Act of 2019, which is new legislation having been passed in April of this year. The Investment Fund Act 2019 has been assented to by the Governor General. However, it has not yet been brought into force. The Investment Fund Act 2019, once brought to force, will repeal and replace the Chapter 369A, the old Investment Fund Act, and will modernize the administration of activities related to investment funds in the Bahamas. Mr. Speaker, the Investment Fund Act 2019 will modernize the investment funds industry by introducing an overhaul of the legal and regulatory framework compliant with international standards and best practices. The 2019 legislation includes improved investor protection provisions and laid the foundation for new and increased business to the Bahamas. Mr. Speaker, as I have previously advised this House, the investment fund industry is a critical component of the Bahamas financial services. As at 31st December 2018, there were 749 licensed investment funds and 62 licensed investment fund administrators in the jurisdiction. Moreover, various business innovations have developed to be world-leading products, such as the specific mandate alternative regulatory test funds, also known as the SMART funds, as well as the investment condominium, or the ICON fund. Mr. Speaker, during the debate of the investment fund bill in this honorable House, it came to the attention of the Securities Commission, who was responsible for developing the legislation that contained key issues in the bill, would give rise to anomalies in the practical application of the bill once passed. The Commission prepared draft movements at that time, which, however, were not submitted in time for consideration by this House during the initial debate. In addition, upon a review of the Investment Act 2019 to address new issues of substance being raised specifically in relation to the investment funds industry, the Commission identified two further areas that needed to be addressed to meet the standards being proposed by the EU. Mr. Speaker, these amendments are prompted by the need to provide minor clarifications and to correct and close any existing or perceived legislative gaps, and to clarify the law where there is ambiguity or uncertainty under the Act. Having provided the background for the impetus of the amendments, allow me to provide a summary of the amendments being proposed and to discuss the more substantive changes this amendment bill will introduce. Mr. Speaker, the bill proposes to amend sections 3, 24, 52, 54, 60, 68, and 84, 91, and 154, and introduces new sections 62A, 62B, and 62C to the Investment Funds Act 2019. In summary, the proposed amendments introduce new definitions and amendments to current definitions, clarifies the requirements for a fund to appoint an investment fund manager licensed or registered by the Commission, clarifies the obligations of an investment fund administrator, provides a valuation regime for standard investment funds, clarifies the categories of persons eligible to be appointed as custodians for an investment fund, clarifies the provision addressing stamp duties exemption for investment funds, provides for the approval of an external AIFM custodian by the Commission. Mr. Speaker, of the proposed amendments, two are substantive changes, being the creation of valuation and custodian regimes for standard funds. Hello? The need to introduce these systems became apparent when the Securities Commission was asked to provide the European Union with a summary of its supervisory regime for investment funds specifically. Further, it was brought to the Commission's attention that certain standards for substance requirements were being contemplated for investment funds by the European Union. These standards include having regimes for annual audits, ongoing reporting obligations, as well as having oversight regimes for valuation funds offered to retail investors, as well as oversight for custodians appointed to hold the assets of investment funds. Mr. Speaker, the Commission was able to confirm that the 2019 Act contemplated all of the required standards saved for the requirements relating to valuations and custodians. In its preparation of the required report, the Commission identified that the 2019 Act had specific valuation and custodian regimes for investment funds that fell within the AIFMD, but that there were no such provision made for the domestic investment funds offered to retail investors. The Commission determined that it was necessary to ensure consistency between the standard of AFMED funds are required to meet the domestic funds under the Act. So there should be no difference between a AIFMD AFMED fund or a domestic Bahamian fund. And so the bill is seeking to remove that anomaly. Mr. Speaker, these proposed amendments places the responsibility on the investment fund manager to ensure that each standard fund he manages has policies and procedures appropriate to the nature, scale, and complexity of the fund so as to enable the proper and independent valuation of the assets of the standard fund. This standard is particularly relevant to the standard fund as investors in these funds are not accredited or professional investors, and as such, are offered a higher level of oversight and supervision. This requirement for valuation enables the Commission, as well as investors, to have a better understanding of the performance of the fund and to make informed decisions as to actions that ought to be taken in relation to regulatory oversight or investing respectively. Mr. Speaker, the amendment bill further requires that the net asset value of the equity interest of a standard fund is calculated and disclosed to the investors. This requirement is in line with one of the overall objectives of the 2019 Act to ensure that there are appropriate standards for transparency, to ensure that investors are aware of matters relevant to their investment decisions. The amendments require that the assets of the standard fund are valued and the net asset value of the equity interest is calculated at least once every year, thereby ensuring regularity. Mr. Speaker, the amendments also include requirements for the appointment of appropriate parties to conduct evaluations to ensure the independence and integrity of the function. There is the ability to appoint internal valuers from within the investment manager, or a fund manager may choose to engage an external valuer as appropriate. You convinced? This is really not for you. This is for the industry. Mr. Speaker, I do accept that this is technical language and technical speech. And I know there are other pressing emergencies. I appreciate that, but Mr. Speaker, with respect, exactly. I don't know what action, but Mr. Speaker, it is important. Unfortunately, it is important that we put these things on the record because there are people who are listening outside of this Parliament, in the international community, that are looking to see what the Bahamas is doing. And so that is why it's kind of important that we do present some of this information. And I do apologize for the technical nature of it, but unfortunately it is, as they say, what it is. Mr. Speaker, where an internal valuer is appointed, there must be a Chinese wall of separation between the internal valuers, where the internal valuer must have remuneration policies in place that are statutorily obligated to ensure that the measures are taken to avoid undue influence on employees. The proposed provisions are progressive and reflect the international standard adopted to address issues of independence and conflict of interest. Mr. Speaker, having explained the proposed regime being introduced for valuers, I now turn to discuss very briefly the proposed amendments related to the appointment of custodians. The proposed amendment in this regard is very simple, as it provides that a custodian appointed to an investment fund licensed under the Investment Fund Act 2019 must be either a bank and trust company licensed under the Bank and Trust Company Regulation Act, Chapter 316, a person registered under the Securities Industry Act 2011, number 10 of 2011, or an institution approved by the Commission and subject to prudential regulation and ongoing provision in a prescribed jurisdiction. This amendment is simply to ensure that custodians appointed to hold the assets of Bahamian licensed funds are qualified financial institutions that are subject to the oversight of the regulator in the Bahamas, or is subject to the regulation in the jurisdiction that the Commission has prescribed. Mr. Speaker, the Investment Fund Act 2019 provides the Commission regulatory oversight of custodians as they are defined as a party to an investment fund, which enables the Commission to require information, inspect, and bring regulatory actions against custodians appointed to the licensed funds. These amendments will mean the Investment Fund Act 2019 will create a regime in the investment fund industry which is compliant with the EU proposed substance standard for investment funds. And that is a relatively new development, Mr. Speaker, where the standard has been moved again, if you will, to include investment funds. Again, and all of our competitive jurisdictions are having to recognize the same legislation. Mr. Speaker, I'll now move to a brief synopsis of the other various amendments proposed to clarify ambiguities within the Investment Fund Act. The proposed amendment to Section 3 of the Act, which is the interpretation section, will insert and define the new term external valuer and amend the term investment fund administrator and principal office. The inclusion of the new definition of external valuer is a necessary part of the creation of the valuation regime for the standard funds. The amendment to the term investment fund administration and principal office are to clearly separate the role of principal office from that of the administrator. This separation, Mr. Speaker, is another element of the original objective of the 2019 Act, which was the realignment of the duties in the investment fund legislation to ensure that the parties were made responsible for duties appropriate to their roles. In this instance, the obligation to have the administrator introduce inequitable burden on the administrator in relation to which he would have no choice. The proposed amendment in this regard allows the administrator to choose whether he wishes to be obligated or have the obligations of a principal office. Mr. Speaker, the amendment proposed in Section 52 and 60 replaces various references to principal office with a reference to administrative services, and this amendment ensures that the separation between the administrator and the principal office is carried throughout the legislation and implements the changes made to Section 3. The proposed Section 52 amendment gives the administrator the option of acting as the principal office of a fund that he administers. However, in the event that he determines not to serve as such an officer, the amendment obligates the administrator to make amendments for a principal for a principal office in the Bahamas. This amendment is therefore able to align the obligations appropriately while providing the service provider the flexibility of determining whether he provides the service or he outsources it. The amendment also, however, ensures that the obligation on the fund to appoint a principal office in the Bahamas is appropriately placed on the administrator, who is appropriately responsible for ensuring the fund meets all of the administrative obligations, such as appointing a principal office. Of note, Mr. Speaker, is the proposed amendment to Section 154, which clarifies that all investment fund share transfers are exempt from stamp duty, and that is an important area for the industry, Mr. Speaker, that they've been asking for. So the proposed amendment to Section 154 clarifies that all investment fund share transfers are exempt from stamp duty. The imposition of such a tax in these circumstances would severely affect the competitiveness of the Bahamas investment funds, as there are no other jurisdiction in this hemisphere that imposes a tax duty or similar levy on transfers of shares in a fund. The technical premise for supporting the application of an exemption to share transfer is based in the nature of the investment fund business and the fact that shares of a fund are not in a practical sense representative of a transfer in ownership of property in the sense that usually gives rise to such duty. The transfer of shares in this scenario reflects the transition of the investment in the fund, and thus should not be captured in a levy or true ownership of an asset. Mr. Speaker, the application of stamp duty in this area would do irreparable damage to the industry. Moreover, this is not the intended scenario for the application of this type of duty. In relation to concerns raised regarding ring fencing, I note that this exemption will not be fodder for the EU, as the exemption will apply to all funds, both domestic and foreign, and would take no account of the underlying equity through which the fund is established. Mr. Speaker, the remaining amendments speak to clarifications that are primarily provisions that relate to the substantive change made above, or a purely typographical nature requiring deletions or incorrect referencing. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, the proposed amendments to the Investment Fund Act 2019 before us are necessary for our continued compliance with international standards. They are also proactive and progressive. In the current climate, the Bahamas must keep abreast of anticipated developments on the international stage. We must also be proactive about keeping pace with the standard setters and charting the course of continued growth and development of this important industry. These proposed amendments are a good example of being proactive and keeping pace, and are in alignment with global standards. Again, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Securities Commission. I want to thank all of the technical officers in our various ministries for the continued vigilance and effort that they put into ensuring that the Bahamas name remains clear and that we remain a premier leader in the international financial services sector. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do second this bill.
Thank you, Honorable Member Asmani. The chair recognizes the Honorable Member for the Exumas and Ragged Island.
It would be long. We have to go do some work. Call to action. Call to action.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, I rise on behalf of the people of Exuma, and Ragged Island. Mr. Speaker, the senior man has spoken. So therefore, Mr. Speaker, I do not intend to be very long. Mr. Speaker, firstly, let me congratulate industry participants. And I understand there's been a national AML task force who was charged to look after many of these matters. And I congratulate the industry generally for their support, their feedback, and for soldiering on in fighting for this important pillar in our economy. Mr. Speaker, financial services indeed has been the source of high-paying jobs and creation of opportunities for Bahamians for quite some time. And notwithstanding the various threats from international bodies, there are many in the industry who could work anywhere in the world, could work in any industry in the world, but they soldier on. And I commend them for their commitment to the industry. Mr. Speaker, I'd also like to congratulate the member for Yamacraw, who has recently taken the substantive position with responsibility for financial services. The member for Yamacraw is one of my candidates on the other side, Mr. Speaker.
Not I'm good right here. Not I'm good Bamboo Town. You know, that's my MP. You know, you put me in the wrong
Mr. Speaker, and I wish him well. In all seriousness.
Breaking news.
Mr. Speaker, we, the opposition, don't have many serious burning issues with this compendium. We do have some concerns about the Non-Profit Organizations Bill 2019. We find that This is an updated version of legislation we did not support, and we previously warned would be problematic among civil society.
Yes, you did.
And religious and other non-profit organizations. As usual, this government pressed on and did not listen to our good advice. So today we are here, we are where we are. It appears common practice of this administration, Mr. Speaker, to come back for quick amendments on bills just passed. In fact, we believe that this state of play can be avoided if there is more listening and an improvement to the process of bringing and presenting these pieces of legislation. This government appears to think that only its members have any idea how governance works, or how the law works, or non-profit how they work, or how legislation should be crafted. But Mr. Speaker, we said over and repeatedly, as an opposition, we are here to help. And we are here to ensure that the legislation that's passed by this House is best in class. True to form, Mr. Speaker, the government ended up shelving the NPO legislation until it consulted with stakeholders whom they said were already consulted. We saw a firestorm of protests against the NPO bill that...
Chair recognizes the honourable member for East Grand Bahama on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I just want to clarify in case there is some ambiguity or doubt. The member said that who they said were consulted. And I just want to assure him that the religious community, I was there myself, the Attorney General, as well as others and other organizations were consulted prior to that initial NPO bill being laid. I'm not going to say that they all agreed. That's a different discussion. But to say that they were not consulted would be incorrect, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, when we talk about consultation, we talk about meaningful consultation, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, again.
Chair recognizes the honourable member for East Grand Bahama.
Again, the member is misleading, and I just wanted to make sure that the record is clear. Yeah. We've had, I personally
said this already,
have had several, yeah, so you're repeating the same thing, so I have to get up and say it.
Sit down, man.
We had several consultations where we've had back and forth dialogue with these organizations, Mr. Speaker. Again, as I said in my contribution, when you talk about regulation and stakeholders, there are often times where there's going to be a difference of opinion and a decision has to be made. And the government has an obligation to make those decisions, and we do. Does not mean that we didn't consult. Does not mean that we did not have meaningful consultation. It did not mean that we did not take into consideration. But it means we had to make a decision, and we made the decision. Based upon subsequent conversations, other things may come to light, or there may be some other reason for us to amend the legislation. Right? And that's what we've done. So I think it's very unfair to try to characterize that as not having meaningful consultation. That is not true.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful that the member thought it necessary to repeat himself. Mr. Speaker, my point on the issue is very clear. After the passage of the first version of the NPO bill, there was a firestorm of protest in the public.
The church.
And therefore, it is my view, Mr. Speaker.
It is your view. Yes.
It is my view that there could have been more meaningful consultation on the bill. And I stand with that.
That's your view, yeah.
So no matter how many times the member for East Grand Bahama repeat himself, that is my view. That's my considered view, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I do believe that the contributions from the various non-profit organizations, the contributions from the religious community, including the Christian Council, after the passage of that piece of legislation, would substantiate, certainly, that they were of the view that their views had not been properly considered. Mr. Speaker, I am not at all surprised that the government is now presenting amendments to that bill or to many of these bills, Mr. Speaker. I understand the deadline for passage of this legislation is sometime before September or during September, Mr. Speaker. The government had since December to amend this legislation, but why do so early what you can do at the very last minute? Why do yesterday what you can do today? Appears to be the guiding philosophy of this administration, Mr. Speaker. One of the things I pointed out about this legislation in December is that we were doing it before we did campaign finance reforms. Something this government promised. When they were in opposition, they promised it. They marched for it. They demanded it. And they said they will do it. But they chose instead to provide regulations for the churches before they provide regulations for themselves and political parties. But such is the case, Mr. Speaker. 8 months later, there's still no campaign finance reforms. Perhaps we'll get that. Perhaps we'll get that, Mr. Speaker. We'll get around to that perhaps around the same time as Ragged Island gets its Green City. Mr. Speaker,
It is a 5-year term.
when this bill was tabled, I didn't quite understand some of the logic. Of course, I understand the need to conform to recommendations of the FATF with regard to regulating these unincorporated organizations in order to avoid blacklisting, in order to bring our industry in line with international best practice. But I think it's haste, in haste, the government painted every non-profit organization with much too broad a brush with the piece of legislation that was passed. So fundamentally, Mr. Speaker, we have no issues with transparency and accountability. In fact, we think many of the established nonprofit organizations will benefit as a result of the legislation, because international donor organizations perhaps will look at them even more favorably. Under the original bill, though, nonprofit entities would have been requested to essentially re-register under this law, in practice, duplicating their regulatory requirements by registering under both pieces of legislation. It would also, in my view, Mr. Speaker, compromise the confidentiality that many people seek when they make donations, even relatively large donations to these entities that do so much good for our communities. Many of these organizations, Mr. Speaker, stand in the gap where the government isn't able to assist, where the Member of Parliament may not be able to assist, and I'm sure we all know that there are many pressing demands. These organizations stand in the gap, and we are grateful for all they do for the Bahamian people. When the government cut the budget for social services, these types of organizations stand in the gap. They stand in the gap, Mr. Speaker, and provide services.
Honorable member, the member for East Grand Bahama. On a point of order, the chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama.
Speaker, I think again, the member is being a little bit disingenuous. The budget of social services, particularly for those services that provide direct benefit to the Bahamian people, has not been cut. In fact, there's a little increase. So it is inaccurate to say services to the behaviored people have been cut.
Mr. Speaker, the Book of Estimates, and I don't want to revisit it, Mr. Speaker, because I've indicated that, we generally have no real pressing issues, Mr. Speaker. But the point must be made. The point must be made, Mr. Speaker, that when the government cut its budget for social services, as was done, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member.
The overall budget was...
The chair recognizes the honourable member for Southern Shores on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I realize that the good member is called to action. And I want the good member, as he actionizes himself, to be complete in his informing. He did say when the government cut the budget for social services, and I trust that even while he was not there, he's able to go back into the last 5 years when he would be looking for how the government would have cut social services. But you don't like old stories. You don't like old stories.
Mr. Speaker, so there's no confusion, Mr. Speaker. I would just like to refer the members opposite to the Book of Estimates that we recently discussed in the budget debate. I don't plan to relitigate the budget, Mr. Speaker. I simply point out that between the Department of Social Services and the ministry, and when you compared the bottom line totals, Mr. Speaker, there was a total cut of roughly 1.3 million. Mr. Speaker.
The chair recognizes the honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, I rise on a point of order. I rise on a point of order. Mr. Speaker, while what he is saying is true, the explanation, the explanation was given that all social assistance was increased, like it went up or it got more. The cut that is being noted was cuts for personal emoluments for persons who no longer exist. See, we in the FNM refuse to pay people who are either dead or have retired. And so those cuts represent those people who are no longer there. Social assistance, Mr. Speaker, and Bahamians who are listening everywhere, has been increased, is now more than it used to be.
Mr. Speaker, again, I have a thought that numbers are pretty definitive. Yes. And I don't believe that the member for East Grand Bahama would disagree with me. And I make a very clear point. The clear point is that the budget for the ministry and the department was cut by 1.3 million.
Agreed.
And the member for East Grand Bahama don't disagree, and the member for Southern Shores do not disagree. That's right. And therefore I move on, Mr. Speaker.
The point is made.
I move on, Mr. Speaker. This is an exciting week in the country, Mr. Speaker. And I move on, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will say that the new piece of legislation for new non-profit organizations is in fact better. It's better than the last version, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, there are still some concerns expressed by the civil society Bahamas that even though the bill is better, Mr. Speaker, it is still perhaps not where it needs to be. The first bill the government brought, the bad bill, would have lumped in churches and not-for-profit schools, Mr. Speaker. Those no longer fall under the legislation for the most part. I couldn't imagine, Mr. Speaker, what the other side was thinking.
The chair recognizes the honourable member for East Grand Bahama on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, the member said that churches and schools were included in the old bill and that they're not included in the current bill. That is not necessary. That's not an accurate statement, Mr. Speaker. The legislation speaks to a lighter touch of regulation, meaning that instead of them having to declare and provide information on all of their donors and contributors as a automatic, that they must keep financial records of all these entities and produce them upon request. They're not excluded. They're just that there's a lighter touch regulation that's been occasioned by this bill. I just want to make sure that nobody goes away thinking that they don't have to report. They do have to keep the records.
Mr. Speaker, I invite the Honourable Minister and Member for East Grand Bahama to perhaps not be too hasty and perhaps take an opportunity to listen all the way through to the thoughts that I present, Mr. Speaker. Because certainly if there's an interruption to the thought process after the first phrase, Mr. Speaker, the full impact of the point may be missed. And I know the member for East Grand Bahama means well on this issue in clarifying the point. But I ask him, Mr. Speaker, to assert his capacity to listen all the way through, Mr. Speaker. The original bill, Mr. Speaker, would have required nonprofit organizations to declare their anticipated source of contributions, Mr. Speaker. It would have required copies of their articles of association. It would have required the identity of the controllers and other officers and members. The entities would have had to report their annual income. Do we really need to understand how much the Anglican Church take in, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, for the most part, this is in fact a better piece of legislation, although in some respects there are still some concerns, Mr. Speaker. The first bill would have required documentary evidence of how that gross annual income from the Anglican diocese, for example, was applied. Do we really need to know what the Anglican Church chooses to spend its money on? Aren't these organizations global, Mr. Speaker? Do you really believe they're working in concert with some worldwide financial conspiracy? I don't believe that this government intended that, but certainly intended that these bills would bring the industry generally in line with international best practice. I'm certain this government didn't expect international good organizations like Bahamas Red Cross, Amnesty International to show evidence of know your customer, etc., Mr. Speaker. Thankfully, Mr. Speaker, the amendments have done away with much of the onerous requirements and have, in fact, Mr. Speaker, lightened the load with respect to the onerous requirements to comply with many of the original points outlined in the nonprofit organization. Mr. Speaker, the amendments say a nonprofit organization whose gross annual income does not exceed $75,000 per annum shall not be required to maintain records under this section. And I believe when the minister stood, that's one of the points he wanted to make. This is better in that it reduces reporting burden on small nonprofits. Mr. Speaker, there was a concern in the original piece of legislation that it may have suppressed the associations of small churches, Mr. Speaker. And that was an original fear in the earlier piece of legislation, and I'm delighted, Mr. Speaker, that that has been amended in this new piece of legislation. The government has also wisely removed the burden of paying fees when registering under the bill for existing entities whose gross annual income does not exceed $250,000. And for those that do exceed this threshold, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the points I make consistently is that financial services is a confidence business. And generally speaking, Mr. Speaker, unless this government proceed to do something that we consider to be reckless, we will generally see how we can work along with the industry, its regulators, and the government to ensure that we have best-in-class legislation. And therefore, many of these issues we do not consider to be controversial, Mr. Speaker. But certainly on these issues, we reiterate the point that many of these institutions, like the Great Commission ministries that feed people, and many of the other local non-profit organizations, go about doing what they do, Mr. Speaker, with the best of intentions and with the best of heart. And we recognize, Mr. Speaker, the need to create a balance between doing good and what is good for the financial services industry and what is in fact best practice in the industry. So, Mr. Speaker, without completely belaboring the point in comparisons of the old bill, the bad bill, versus the new bill, the better bill, Mr. Speaker, I will simply make the point that we in the Bahamas, the jurisdiction, committed to international best practice. And we ask the government to also be committed to presenting and bringing better pieces of legislation that does not require immediate amendment. Mr. Speaker, the Civil Society Bahamas indicated that they have done extensive consultations across the islands of the Bahamas with 33 distinct NPOs in numerous islands. The organization indicated they received the proposed amendments from the government in May. Now, this piece of legislation was put on hold in December, but didn't come back to civil society until May. Knowing full well, Mr. Speaker, that we had to pass this before the end of August. So, Mr. Speaker, we received some advice from civil society Bahamas, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Speaker, they've indicated, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, that notwithstanding, Mr. Speaker, there are three remaining issues and concerns. I'm grateful that civil society Bahamas has shared this information with us, and we assure them that we stand with them, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the next time, Mr. Speaker, I visit with the leadership candidate on the other side of his ministry, Mr. Speaker, for working roll-up-the-sleeve meetings, Mr. Speaker. I trust that there will be no photo-ops and that we will work through the details of the legislation. Mr. Speaker, I will share the detailed report from civil society Bahamas with the government, and I trust that in future considerations and in future amendments, they consider the three remaining issues that's raised by civil society Bahamas. They include the development and the establishment of a dedicated advisory committee, and an inclusion of the inclusion of all levels of registered NPOs in the declaration of financial reporting, regardless of financial size, etc. And again, Mr. Speaker, we discussed this point earlier, and there simply needs to be, in the future, Mr. Speaker, more meaningful consultation up front to ensure that we avoid these kinds of back and forth. Thirdly, the provision of informal groups to organize and operate for a period of 6 months prior to consideration of formal registration. And certainly we will provide all of the details on these points to the government. And Mr. Speaker, I reiterate my thanks to Civil Society Bahamas, many who work on a volunteer basis, who make contributions to better legislation in the Bahamas. We're delighted that they've shared with us their concerns, and we assure them that we stand with them, and we will always ensure that their concerns are voiced and their concerns are heard in the best interest of better legislation in the Bahamas. Mr. Speaker, we all understand the need to protect our financial industry, and I reiterate our complete support for transparency and accountability. And I reiterate that it's good for nonprofit organizations. And I reiterate that I trust that it will help them in the raising of funding, particularly from international donor organizations. Generally, the financial services industry, though it's dwindling, it's still immensely valuable and can be made to thrive again. Even if this government has no plans to grow it, I assure the government of our complete support to the industry in working together on an ongoing long-term strategic plan to take advantage of the niches that might be available in the industry, Mr. Speaker, in this industry. Mr. Speaker, in our haste, I call on the government again to consider in future all of the input from the opposition. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, there are some things greater than politics. Yes. We are committed to the financial services industry, and we're committed to seeing how we can help them to grow this business. And therefore, we generally have no objection to good legislation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we again appreciate the work of the industry. We appreciate the work of regulators. We say thanks to industry professionals who work diligently on these issues to advance the industry, to create jobs for Bahamians, and to create opportunities generally in our economy. Mr. Speaker, before I rest, I would like to wish a joyous, prosperous, and restful summer wherever possible to the people of Exuma and Exuma Keys and Ragged Island. Exuma, my hometown, I shall see you shortly, right after the Progressive Liberal Party convention this weekend. During this time, Mr. Speaker, we will let the people of the Bahamas know what plans are in store for them from their government in waiting, Mr. Speaker. Beginning at 7 p.m. tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, we will begin to lay out a plan for the future, a plan that the Bahamian people can embrace and believe in. Mr. Speaker, from Duncantown to Highland Key, Mr. Speaker, I will shortly release my midterm report to the people of Exuma, which is benchmarked against my eVision 2030 plan, my vision for the island of Exuma. And that report will go to every door and every house, beginning next week. It will demonstrate, Mr. Speaker, that together we can achieve much. We can aspire to achieve, and we can achieve. Mr. Speaker, this report will in fact be a call to action. Yes. For many more non-profit organizations in our country to continue to rise to the occasion. It will be a call to action, Mr. Speaker, for more volunteers across the length and breadth of our Bahamas to rise to the occasion and to help to build and to grow our country. Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for the opportunity for standing on behalf of the people of Exuma and Ragged Island, and I rise to their call to act. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Member Asmani. The chair recognizes the Honorable Member for Bamboo Town.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to move the following resolution. Be it resolved that the business of this House do continue beyond 1 p.m. today, Wednesday, July 24th, 2019.
Second. Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the business of this House do extend beyond the 1 p.m. hour. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. The business of this House, it is ordered, will proceed beyond the 1 p.m. hour. As many? The chair recognizes the Honorable Member for East Grand Bahama.
Mr. Speaker, I rise for the wrap-up. Mr. Speaker, I join with my friend and colleague, my good friend and colleague from Exuma, as he made his campaign speech. I want to, his call to action, yes. I want to support him. He said he's the government in waiting. The only thing I would say to him is to watch the gallery, because there are people in the gallery who are looking at his position. On that side. They're in waiting too. I have a feeling they can wait a long time, but they can wait longer than they gotta wait. But we'll see. But Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to yeah, one of your candidates too? We're the leader. We're the leader. You might want to talk. Listen, I hope he isn't talking about the leader. Anyway, I can leave that between them. But Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to make sure that the non-profit organization community understand that nothing contained in this legislation, either in this amendment or in the original bill, was intended or imposed any additional suspicion or any kind of aspersion on their operations. That was never the intent. It was never the intent for the government to get involved in the operation of any institution. That is not the responsibility or remit of a government. We are not a fascist state or some communist state. We're not interested in the activities of organizations. What we are interested in is ensuring that our jurisdiction does not inadvertently become a conduit for illicit or proliferation or nefarious activities. That is our obligation to the international community. And if you think that charitable organizations are not used for this kind of activity, you only have to go to the north, and you will be combated with all kind of organizations and foundations and things that are doing all manner of things that are not in the interest of law-abiding states. And so that is our only objective, to make sure that we do as best we can, in accordance with international standards, to protect our jurisdiction from being used as a conduit for terrorist financing or any other proliferation of illegal activities. So that's all this is, Mr. Speaker. And again, we support non-profit organizations. The work of the church in our country is legendary, is beyond question. We could not do the kind of things we do and have the kind of social interaction we have without the church and without many of the civil organizations that exist and contribute to the social fabric of this country. And so I don't want there to be any doubt in respect to the government's support, encouragement, and protection of nonprofit organizations, religious organizations, civic organizations in this country. We need more, as the good member said, to step up to the plate, to do more, particularly when it comes to serving the needs of our youth and those that are most vulnerable and challenged in this country. So, Mr. Speaker, with those words, I want to now move for the closure debate and the third reading and passing of these compendium of bills. Second reading and committal of these compendium of bills. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Member. Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded. Wait a minute. I don't have it. It has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for a second time and committed. A bill for an act to amend the Anti-Terrorism Act to provide for the definition of designated entity and the offense of proliferation and the financing of proliferation in respect to reporting requirements. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. Order that the bill be read for a second time and committed.
A bill for an act to amend the Anti-Terrorism Act to provide for the definition of designated entity and the offense of proliferation and the financing of proliferation in respect to reporting requirements.
For the second reading and committal of bills. Chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama.
Mr. Speaker, I move for second reading committal a bill for an act to amend the International Obligations Economic and Ancillary Measures Act.
Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for a second time and committed. A bill for an act to amend the International Obligations Economic and Ancillary Measures Act. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. Order that the bill be read for a second time and committed.
A bill for an act to amend the International Obligation, Economic and Ancillary Measures Act.
For the second reading and committal of bills. The chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama.
Mr. Speaker, I read for a second. I move for a second time the reading of the second reading and committal of a bill for an act to amend the Investment Funds Act 2019.
Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for a second time and committed. A bill for an act to amend the Investment Funds Act 2019. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. Order that the bill be read for a second time and committed.
A bill for an act to amend the Investment Funds Act 2019.
For the second reading and committal of bills. Chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move for second reading and committal a bill for an act to amend the Non-Profit Organization Act 2019.
Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for a second time and committed. A bill for an act to amend the Non-Profit Organization Act 2019. As many as in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. Order that the bill be read for a second time and committed.
A bill for an act to amend the Non-Profit Organization Act 2019.
For the second reading and committal of bills. The chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama.
Mr. Speaker, I move for second reading and committal a bill for an act to amend the Register of Beneficial Ownership Act 2018.
Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for a second time and committed. A bill for an act to amend the Register of Beneficial Ownership Act 2019. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. Order that the bill be read for a second time and committed.
A bill for an act to amend the Register of Beneficial Ownership Act 2019.
For the second reading and committal of bills. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Bamboo Town.
Mr. Speaker, there are no further second readings. I do now move, Mr. Speaker, that the House resolve itself into a committee of the whole with the Deputy Speaker in the chair. I second that, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that this House resolve itself in the Committee of the Whole House with the Deputy Speaker and Chairman of the Committee of the Whole House in the chair. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. The House will now resolve itself in the Committee of the Whole House with the Deputy Speaker and Chairman of the Committee of the Whole House in the chair.
Committee of the Whole. As many. The chair recognizes the member for Bamboo Town. I know. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I do move that the long title of a bill for an act to amend the Anti-Terrorism Act to provide for the definition of designated entities and the offense of proliferation and the financing of proliferation in respect to reporting requirements be agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I second that.
It's been moved and seconded that the long title of the bill be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The long title of the bill is agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I do now move that the short title be agreed.
Mr. Chair, I second that.
It's been moved and seconded that the short title of the bill be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The short title of the bill is agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I do now move that clauses 2 through 9 be agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I second that.
It's been moved and seconded that clause 2 through 9 of the bill be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. Clause 2 through 9 of the bill is agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I do now move that the bill in its entirety be agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I second that.
It's been moved and seconded that the bill in its entirety be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The bill is agreed in its entirety.
Mr. Chairman, I do now move that the long title of a bill for an act to amend the International Obligations, Economic and Ancillary Measures Act be agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I second that.
It's been moved and seconded that the long title of the bill be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The long title of the bill is agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I do now move that the short title be agreed.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that the short title of the bill be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The short title of the bill is agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I do move that clauses 2 through 3 be agreed. 3B be agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I second that.
Been moved and seconded that clause 2 through 3B be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. Clause 2 through 3B is agreed.
Mr. Chair, I do move that the bill in its entirety be agreed.
Mr. Chair, I second that.
Been moved and seconded that the bill in its entirety be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The bill is agreed in its entirety.
Mr. Chairman, I do now move for third reading. I do move for the long title of a bill for an act to amend the Investment Funds Act 2019 be agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I second that.
Been moved and seconded that the long title of the bill be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The long title of the bill is agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the short title be agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I second that.
Been moved and seconded that the short title of the bill be agreed. As many members that are in favor will remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The short title of the bill is agreed.
Mr. Chair, I do move that clauses 2 through 12 be agreed.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that clause 2 through 12 of the bill be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. Clause 2 through 12 of the bill is agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the bill in its entirety be agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I second that.
Been moved and seconded that the bill in its entirety be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The bill is agreed in its entirety.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the long title of the bill for an act to amend the Non-Profit Organization Act 2019 be agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I second that.
Been moved and seconded that the long title of the bill be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The long title of the bill is agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the short title and commencement be agreed.
Second.
Been moved and seconded that the short title and commencement of the bill be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The short title and commencement of the bill is agreed.
Mr. Chair, I do now move that clauses 2 through, I think this may have a schedule to it as well.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, that clauses 2 through 18 be agreed.
Second.
Been moved and seconded that clause 2 through 18 of the bill be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The bill is, clause 2 through 18 of the bill is agreed.
Mr. Chair, I do move that the first schedule be agreed.
Been moved and seconded that the first schedule of the bill be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The first schedule of the bill is agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the second schedule to the bill be agreed.
Second. It's been moved and seconded that the second schedule of the bill be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The second schedule of the bill is agreed.
Mr. Chair, I do now move that the third schedule to the bill be agreed.
Second. It's been moved and seconded that the third schedule of the bill be agreed. As many members in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The third schedule of the bill is agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I do now move that the bill in its entirety be agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I second that. It's been moved and seconded that the bill in its entirety be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The bill is agreed in its entirety.
Mr. Chairman, I do now move that the long title of a bill for an act to amend the Registration of Beneficial Ownership Act 2019 be agreed.
Second. Being moved and seconded that the long title of the bill be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The long title of the bill is agreed.
Mr. Chair, I do now move that the short title and commencement be agreed.
Second. Been moved and seconded that the short title and commencement of the bill be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The short title and commencement of the bill is agreed.
I do move that clause 2 be agreed.
Been moved and seconded that clause 2 of the bill be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. Clause 2 of the bill is agreed.
Mr. Chair, I do move that the bill in its entirety be agreed.
Mr. Chairman, I second that. It's been moved and seconded that the bill in its entirety be agreed. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The bill is agreed in its entirety.
Mr. Chair, I do now move that the Speaker takes the chair.
Second. It's been moved and seconded that the Speaker now do take the chair. As many members that are in favor remain seated. Those opposing will rise. The Speaker will now take the chair. Order of members, Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to report that the committee has gone through the bills, making no amendments thereto.
Honorable members, the Deputy Speaker and Chairman of the Committee of the Whole House has reported that the Committee of the Whole House has gone through the various bills, having made no amendments thereto. Third reading and passing of bills. The Chair recognizes the Honorable Member for Bamboo Town.
Mr. Speaker, I move for third reading and passing of a bill for an act to amend the Anti-Terrorism Act to provide for the definition of designated entities and the offense of proliferation and the financing of proliferation in respect to reporting requirements.
Second, that was
Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for a third time and pass. A bill for an act to amend the Anti-Terrorism Act to provide for the definition of designated entity and the offense of proliferation and the financing of proliferation in respect of reporting requirements. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. Order that the bill be read for a third time and pass.
A bill for an act to amend the Anti-Terrorism Act to provide for the definition of designated entity and the offense of proliferation and the financing of proliferation in respect to reporting requirements.
Order that the bill do now pass and the title thereof be declared to be the Anti-Terrorism Amendment Act 2019. Honorable members. For the third reading and passing of bills. Chair recognizes the honorable member for Bamboo Town.
I move for third reading and passing of a bill for an act to amend the International Obligations, Economic and Ancillary Measures Act.
Mr. Speaker, I second that. Yes, hold on.
Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for a third time and pass. A bill for an act to amend the International Obligations, Economic and Ancillary Measures Act. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. Order that the bill be read for a third time and pass.
A bill for an act to amend the International Obligations, Economic and Ancillary Measures Act.
It's insurrection before convention.
Honorable members.
Sorry.
Order that the bill do now pass and the title thereof be declared to be the International Obligations, Economic and Ancillary Measures Amendment Act 2019. For the third reading and passing of bills.
Mr. Speaker, you have to forgive me. We have insurrection taking place as we speak. My goodness, the opposition may change by the time this parliament is closed. I tell you. Mr. Speaker, I move for third reading and passing of a bill for an act to amend the Investment Funds Act 2019.
Mr. Speaker, I second that. The Speaker like a small number.
Honorable members. Honorable members, I know we are approaching the summer. Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for a third time and pass. A bill for an act to amend the Investment Fund Act 2019. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. Order that the bill be read for a third time and pass.
A bill for an act to amend the Investment Funds Act 2019.
Order that the bill do now pass and the title thereof be declared to be the Investment Fund Amendment Act 2019. For the third reading and passing of bills.
Mr. Speaker, I move for third reading and passing of a bill for an act to amend the Non-Profit Organizations Act 2019.
Is there a seconder?
Second that.
Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for a third time and pass. A bill for an act to amend the Non-Profit Organizations Act 2019. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. Order that the bill be read for a third time and pass.
A bill for an act to amend the Non-Profit Organization Act 2019.
Order that the bill do now pass and the title thereof be declared to be the Non-Profit Organizations Amendment Act 2019. For the third reading and passing of bills. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Bamboo Town.
Mr. Speaker, I move for third reading and passing of a bill for an act to amend the Register of Beneficial Ownership Act 2019.
Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read for a third time and pass. A bill for an act to amend the Register of Beneficial Ownership Act 2019. As many as in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. Order that the bill be read for a third time and passed.
A bill for an act to amend the Register of Beneficial Ownership Act 2019.
Order that the bill do now pass and the title thereof be declared to be the Register of Beneficial Ownership Amendment Act 2019. For the third reading and passing of bills. Chair recognizes the honorable member for Bamboo Town.
Mr. Speaker, there are no further third readings, but we do have something that we would like to do in the Parliament before we actually go on our summer recess. And so I would like for us to be able to break for about 15 minutes, but we are going to need the concurrence of the side opposite so that we can actually go back on the agenda to lay the document. The Deputy Prime Minister can speak to that.
Thank you, honorable member. Honorable member for Bamboo Town, the motion for suspension.
Mr. Speaker, I do move that the House suspends for about 15 minutes.
Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the business of this House do suspend for approximately 15 minutes. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. Order that the business of this House suspends for approximately 15 minutes. The government leader of business had indicated to the chair that he wished to go back on the agenda, and there was no objection by the opposition. So we'd go back to laying of documents by ministers. The chair recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to lay on the table of the House the Commonwealth of the Bahamas Treasury accounts detailed by line item for year ended 30th June 2016. Mr. Speaker, and I thank the House for its indulgence. This is important for our financing needs for the rest of the year, and so it needed to be done statutorily before the break, and I do appreciate the indulgence of the House.
Thank you, honorable member. Order that the document be brought up. Order that the document do lie on the table. Further laying of documents by ministers.
No further thing, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Statements and communications by ministers. Communications by the clerk. Messages from the Governor General. Messages from the Senate. Motions for leave of absence, leave to resign, seat, and new writs. Presentation of petitions. Presentation of reports of committees. Adoption of reports of committees. First reading of bills. Second reading and committal of bills. Committee of the whole House. Third reading and passing of bills. Consideration of Senate amendments. Resolutions. Member statements. Appointment of select committees. Instructions to select committees. Discharge of select committees. Notices for future meetings. Chair recognizes the honorable member for Mangrove Key, South and Central Andros.
Speaker, just to note that all the notices standing in the name of the opposition still remain. And we'd like for those to be dealt with if all goes well when we return to this honorable place. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you, honorable member. Chair recognizes the honorable member for Bamboo Town.
Mr. Speaker, I renew all matters in the name of the government. And Mr. Speaker, I do move and signal that the House will adjourn until the 2nd of October, 10 a.m., 2019. Mr. Speaker, I second that.
Honorable members, just before the motion for adjournment, I wish to bring to the attention of this honorable House that on September 29th, the Parliament of the Bahamas will be celebrating 290 years of existence. Years of parliamentary democracy. We have proposed a number of events. On the 29th, that's a Sunday, we wish that you all would have collected yourself from the summer recess and be able to attend our church services on that date. The agenda of the events planned for the celebration will be sent to you during the summer recess. And we're hoping that the celebrations will culminate on the 2nd of October when we return. Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that this House adjourns for the summer recess to 10 a.m. the 2nd of October, 2019. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose would stand. Final adjournment.
Mr. Speaker, I do now move that the House adjourns. Speaker, I do second.
Honorable members, it has been moved and seconded that the House adjourns to 10 a.m. Wednesday, the 2nd of October, 2019. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those who oppose will stand. The House stands adjourned to 10 a.m. Wednesday, the 2nd of October, 2019.
All right.